If music and politics were ever truly separate, which is doubtful, then in the 20th century, composers were to lose their innocence forever. In Eastern Europe in particular, the connection is so strong that we can use the music as a kind of map to trace the whole psychological profile of an era. Music can tell truths, which, if written in words, would have cost the authors their lives. In this program, we follow 3 dark journeys, one, thank goodness, with a happy ending. Béla Bartók was born in 1881 in Hungary, a country stifling, politically and artistically, under the domination of Austria. Any artist who needed to breathe their own native air had to flee the cities. And in the undeveloped peasant communities of the Hungarian countryside, Bartók found his salvation, folk music. Music of a vitality and naturalness that seemed to spring direct from the earth. Bartók realized that this was a natural heritage that must be preserved. He not only recorded it, but was one of the first to tackle the problems of trying to notate it. Folk music is full of the idiosyncrasies of speech, as though a good story had suddenly grown wings and taken flight in song. This was not just art, but a philosophy of living, or, more often, sheer survival. Bartók was one of the first people to really hear folk music as it was, warts and all, full of all its edges. And the strange thing is that when he used it in his own music, it then didn't sound as though he had borrowed it. It sounded as though he'd invented it. It wasn't observed anymore. It was part of his own universe. Bartók's musical universe can be a dark and lonely place. His early opera, Bluebeard's Castle, inhabits the sad, world-weary corner where folk music, twilight tales and nightmares meet the more modern condition of psychological introspection. The tension between the old and the new is Bartók's essential territory. Only Bartók could have taken the Bluebeard legend and identified with Bluebeard himself. It is, in essence, a self-portrait, a man for whom intimate emotional exposure is a violation, a kind of rape. His new wife, Judith, sees the doors in the castle, which represent elements of Bluebeard's life and emotion. And because the doors are locked, she wants to open them. That doesn't seem too unreasonable a proposition, but for Bartók, as for Bluebeard, this was death. Judith unlocks a door and finds inside a vast lake, a lake of tears, all the part of Bluebeard's life that is regret and sorrow. The traumatized stillness of her singing, shows the extent of her devastation. And she sings as though she's dredging up some old, forgotten melody. And it's all done in the rhythms of shocked speech. There's no precedent for the sound that the 29-year-old Bartók makes from the orchestra at this point. Somehow it sounds as though the whole orchestra is sobbing from within. But in fact, as a portrait of a solitary man's soul, there's nothing like this in all music. Bluebeard's castle was, for the audiences of its time, too inward to be recognisable as opera. It had no success in the theatre in his lifetime. In fact, the 20s and 30s were a struggle for him to gain any real acceptance as a composer. When Bartók was asked to write a piece by the great Swiss patron Paul Zacher, He was given a kind of manna from heaven for any composer. He was told he could write whatever he liked, as long as it was for the right forces. What he turned up with was music for strings, percussion, and celesta, which is a piece in which a string orchestra is cut in half and divided through the center by percussion instruments. In using two orchestras, mirroring each other, splitting the orchestra down the center, Bartók is doing an almost miraculous thing. He's fusing together hundreds of years of Western tradition with folk music in a way that you can't see the joins anymore. Counterpoint, which is more easily described as lines playing against each other, joining together, is something that's not available in folk music, which is normally much simpler. But in using two orchestras, he can, as it were, pit folk music against folk music, bashing it backwards and forwards like in some cosmic game of tennis. He's also using the string instruments in a very new way. The string instruments which really were the basis of music for as long as the orchestra existed and were used to mimic singing sounds, and now used to mimic speech and the speed of speech and the percussiveness of speech. The strings are used like percussion instruments, and they are little darts of fireworks into the air. At the very center of this whole piece is the soul of folk music, which is its fierceness, not its prettiness. It wasn't only Bartók's musical language that set him apart. His life through the 20s and 30s became harder as the fascists rose to power in Hungary, and his political outspokenness got him into more and more trouble. In the end, all that remained was exile. In 1940, he left for America, never to return to his homeland. This is the text of a Hungarian folk song. I set out from my lovely home, my beautiful Hungary. I looked back halfway along the road, and my eyes filled with tears. Bartók, a man who had found his whole centre in the countryside, was by bitter irony now stranded in one of the busiest cities on earth, New York. The opening bars of The Miraculous Mandarin had been his nightmare vision of the hell of a city, and now he was living it himself. In every way, he was disorientated. His music wasn't played. He knew almost no one. He was already mortally ill with leukemia. It seemed as though the end had come. At this desperate juncture in Bartók's life, the commission from Koussevitzky and the Boston Symphony Orchestra to write the Concerto for Orchestra must have seemed heaven-sent. Not only could Bartók now move out of the city back into the country where he belonged, but he could also be treated for his leukemia and buy just a little more time to finish his work. In the third movement, the elegy of the Concerto for Orchestra is very much the emotional core. He uses the violas of the orchestra to give out a type of theme which is not only like a distortion of a Hungarian folk theme, but seems almost to speak in words. The folk music is hardly there unless you realize that it has been damaged and deconstructed to the point where sometimes there's only two notes left. It's as though this man, exiled from the part of the world he loved the most, could only bring back just little fragments, as though the paper had been torn up and he'd found it at the bottom of his case. At the end of the movement, there's a link back 35 years to the sighing, sobbing sounds of Bluebeard's castle. The violins quote the Tears theme from Bluebeard, like a message from the composer back to himself. And the piccolo sings of his loneliness, like the last bird on earth. time after the Russian Revolution was a time of enormous optimism, particularly for artists, because everything was allowed, and in this new world, everything seemed possible. The young Shostakovich was truly an idealistic product of his time. But just at the point where he began to reach maturity, Russia changed, and suddenly all the artists were forced either to keep their heads down or to praise the new order. Art was no longer free. At this time, the political landscape had taken on darker and more dangerous colors, and his music couldn't help but reflect this. The Fourth Symphony is a wild, indeed all too accurate portrait of a dangerous and ugly time. After a savage attack on Shostakovich in the state press in January 1936, he and his friends recognized that to perform it would have been dangerous, maybe even suicidal. The premiere was cancelled. One of the things he said a number of times is, you know, of course, we've all been made into automatons now. At the end of the second movement of the Fourth Symphony, you hear for the first time the sound of a musician who has become an automaton. And often when audiences hear it, there's a little giggle at the end of it, because they can't know quite how to take it. He once said, "If the music smiles, don't you believe it?" This was a man in fear of his life. Being the kind of person he was, if his only language was music, then his only way out of this was to compose his way out of trouble. He began to develop a style where he could more or less speak in code, sticking close enough to what seemed to be officially demanded of him, but actually subverting it at every level. The Fifth Symphony, on the surface, seems to be Shostakovich doing exactly what was required of him. In fact, it was even labeled a Soviet artist's reply to just criticism. In the middle of the last movement, he quotes a song on a Pushkin text, which was one of these pieces he wrote and put in his drawer, waiting for better times. The gist of the poem is that whatever graffiti dictators may daub over the works of artists, in time it will fall away and reveal what was there originally. And in a way, that's all that Shostakovich could hope for. By this time, Stalin, and more particularly the power that Stalin had of life and death over every Soviet citizen, became the dominant fact in Shostakovich's life. It suited Stalin's purpose to keep him on edge, and by doing this, he managed to make the most prominent Russian composer toe his line and appear to be the perfect party spokesman. It wasn't until 1969, already 16 years after Stalin's death, that Shostakovich, ill and prematurely old, dared to bear witness to the terror of those years. Now, at the very end of his book Testimony, he writes a sentence which applied to his whole life, but could really apply to the 14th Symphony also. He says, "I had to write this to save a whole generation from the bitterness which has turned my whole life grey." If music was required simply to be uplifting, then the subject of death would be the greatest taboo of all. And in this late symphony, Shostakovich looked at not only the real process of dying, but his own situation of a kind of death in life. Not to say that suffering is noble, but in the grand old Russian tradition of composers and writers, to protest against it, also to protest against death imposed by butchers and tyrants.
Когда твоя мать извивалась, сколько поноса. Злой палач, Адолья, взгляни, без Тихана, я спасись трупа, закопыли. Тебе цепна, тобі скутать, що печірки паляти згорі.
After this great explosion of anger comes a return to looking inwards, with a poem by a contemporary of Pushkin's, Kuchelbecker, who was imprisoned for 20 years in Siberia. The words are addressed to a fellow poet, Delvig, and they express Shostakovich's core belief that the artist has only one advantage over the tyrant, that is truth, and that if the truth is told enough times, in the end it will come through victorious. Witold Lutosławski was still a young man when Poland was rebuilding itself after the devastation of World War II. Although his journey has a positive ending, it took all his ingenuity to find a path through. It's ironic that folk music, which had actually liberated Bartok's creativity, was by now being used to stifle the creativity of all the composers of Lutosławski's generation. Suddenly, music had to conform to the ideal of a happy, obedient proletariat. And, just like those illusory people, it was not supposed to ask questions. For Lutosławski, to be aspiring only to the ideals of that kind of folk music would have been like castrating his own intelligence. folk music was something that had to be done. And it seems an enormous irony that he was able to go through this and still keep his particular lightness of spirit and lightness of touch. Highly intelligent, and in my experience, I would say very patrician, aristocratic type of man. He was not going to be taken in by this. But just how was a composer to cope?
It's the advantage of a composer upon the performers, who must have the real life, in order to exist, and performances. While a composer can write and put here.
A cultural thaw arrived in the mid-1950s, and suddenly the arts were breathing a new air. The Warsaw Autumn Festival was incredibly important in many, many ways. For the Polish government, it was a way of presenting an acceptable face to the world. Great, all very well and good, but for Polish composers, it was a chance finally to hear what was coming from the rest of the world. Now, he'd listened to the music of John Cage, and John Cage was probably even greater thinker and philosopher than he was a musician. His ideas affected people much more than the actual sound of the music. But this idea that chance could play, that one did not have to rigidly organize anything, was immensely appealing for him, and it was like it opened a window in his brain. More flute in there, please. Lutosławski had this idea that you could create great layers of very sophisticated complexity by not telling people exactly where they were going to play.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. I don't know how you managed it all to land up together. Oh, that's incredible. You must not be together when you do this. Right, so see if we can be any less together. Each faster.
Now, this is actually very difficult for orchestral musicians because we spend our whole life being told you must play exactly this there. The idea of being together with another musician is something we imbibe with our mother's milk. So actually, for musicians coming to Lutosławski the first time, it's quite hard because instead of this sound of something going crunch, there's often the sound of a lot of change falling out of your pocket.
Don't worry, Eugene, it's all right. Had you not finished that bit? You just literally, yes, absolutely. It's fantastic, yeah. Yeah. You should have finished your last note, but if I get bored, I shall just go to the next bit. Okay,
It's fun being a conductor.
it's so easy as well.
In Venetian games, he used the very newest techniques to create a new type of magic. There, in the game that we play, there's a flute line that goes through, melismatic, like some kind of long-forgotten folk song, but surrounded by little showers of pebbles of sounds. There's a very characteristic phrase that I read of his, which is saying, I would like to make music that carries the plus sign, not the minus sign. And at a time where many people have felt that modern art and music is difficult to understand, this feeling of optimism is something very, very touching and important. I'll never forget my first meeting with Lutosławski in a small London hotel, in a fairly crowded lobby. He was sitting with his wife on the sofa on one side. And we had many things to talk about. But we immediately fell into talking about politics in Poland. And I have to remember, this was in the early 80s, in the time of Jaruzelski and martial law. And this very soft-spoken man suddenly became very forceful and was saying outrageous things about the politicians and indeed other composers of his time who he felt were servile and lackeys. And I started looking around in case this was being recorded in any way. That, in fact, he had none of the paranoia of the rest of us. And he always somehow managed to follow his own course. He managed to write his own music without compromising himself. And the Third Symphony, which I still feel is his masterpiece, was written all throughout the time of solidarity being recognized, and then through the introduction of martial law. Now, he swore blind that none of this music was about politics. But I don't think there is any way that that music can be divorced from what was happening around it. There is a type of strength in it that comes through living in, as the old Chinese proverb says, living in interesting times. He said once that he wished he could wake up in a new Renaissance time and find that all the music that was being played was contemporary music. He said, nowadays, we feel like mustard at the great feast of music. And you know, everybody dreams of being a beefsteak sometimes.